Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Virtual Evenings for Educators. Super excited to have you here. Tonight, we continue our celebration of Black History Month with a look at the LACMA exhibition, Afro-Atlantic Histories, which is on view until September. If you are in the LA area, definitely come and see it while it's up. It's well worth it. It's a truly amazing exhibition. If you've been with us, you'll know that we started off this program on Tuesday with a fantastic lecture from the exhibition's curators. And this evening, we are very excited to feature Ohio State University professor, Dr. Hasan Kwame Jeffries, who will share his do's and don'ts for classroom instruction on the Black experience during slavery. My name is Laura Schilling, and I'm the content specialist for teacher programs here at LACMA. I am a white woman with curly blonde hair, and I'm wearing a cream-colored sweater tonight. If you would like to access closed captions tonight, you can enable them in the lower right corner of your Zoom screen. And thank you to our live captioners who are here with us today. We appreciate you. We can go to the next slide. And the next slide. I'd like to share a land acknowledgement. LACMA recognizes that we occupy land in Los Angeles County, originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Tataviam, Serrano, Kizh, and Chumash peoples. We honor and pay respect to their elders and descendants, past, present, and emerging, as they continue their stewardship of the lands and waters in Los Angeles County. And you'll see that I included the link to nativeland.ca there in case you're interested in finding out whose native lands you are currently on. It's a really wonderful resource. So we'll go to the next slide and take a brief look at the program agenda. As I said, Tuesday we had a lecture with the curators. Tonight we have our special presentation with Dr. Jeffries. We hope you'll join us next Tuesday as we continue the program with a workshop called Storytelling Quilts. This is based on the work of renowned artist Faith Ringgold, and will be led by a LACMA teaching artist. So definitely come out for that one. That'll be a lot of fun. Get messy with construction paper and scissors and glue. And then on Thursday, we'll finish out the program with another special presentation with musician and ethnomusicologist, Dr. Dawn Norfleet, who's going to be talking about Afro-diasporic music traditions and their connection to resilience and revolution. Next slide. And finally, I'm going to do my plug that I always do. I want to make sure everyone is aware of the digital resources that accompany this program and all other Evenings for Educators programs. These can be found at the link in the chat, which I'm going to share right now. There we go. And they really help to round out the programs and make them more accessible to your students. So take a moment to check those out when you have some time. Next slide. I'll now go ahead and introduce our special speaker this evening. We're very excited to have him here. Hasan Kwame Jeffries is Associate Professor of History at The Ohio State University, where he teaches, researches, and writes about the African American experience. He is the author of Bloody Lowndes, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt, and the editor of Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement, a book of essays by leading civil rights scholars on how to teach the civil rights movement. He also wrote and narrated the 10-episode Audible original series, Great Figures of the Civil Rights Movement. In the classroom, Hasan has won several major teaching awards, including Ohio State University's highest award for teaching. Hasan has worked on several public history projects, including serving as the lead historian for the $27 million renovation of the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee, site of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He also hosts the podcast Teaching Hard History. Welcome, Dr. Jeffries. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be with you. Thank you for extending the invitation for this opportunity to engage with teachers, certainly in and around the LA County area, but really nationally. Of course, the work of LACMA is nationally and internationally known. And so this is just a really a privilege to be able to engage with this community and particularly engage with this community around this topic of teaching slavery and freedom as it's connected to this powerful exhibition, Afro-Atlantic History. So I'm really excited to be able to share this evening, late afternoon out there, evening over here, in Ohio with you all. I have a few slides that I want to share with you, some images, some photographs of some of the material, some of the art in the exhibition, then a few do's and don'ts, points of emphasis for educators when entering in the classroom and teaching about slavery and freedom, and engaging our young scholars and young learners. And then I want to make sure we have plenty of time to open up for conversation and discussion, to hear some of your thoughts and experiences, suggestions that you have, practices, but then also perhaps to answer any questions that you may have as well. I've titled, so let's begin. I've titled my presentation, my remarks for today, Teaching Slavery and Freedom in Today's Classroom. Teaching Slavery and Freedom in Today's Classroom. Obstacles and opportunities, opportunities and obstacles. So this duality, I think that that is incumbent upon us to wrestle with if we want to teach the history of slavery as well as the history of freedom and the struggle for freedom. If we want to teach that both accurately and effectively, we have to be aware of the obstacles, and we have to be able to see and take advantage of the opportunities. Next slide, please. In the summer of 2020, after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, following not long after the killing of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, the killing, the murder, the lynching of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia in February of that year, following the string of very public killings of African Americans at the hands of police, at the hands of vigilantes, all caught on camera, we saw the largest public protests in American history. In June of 2020 and in July of 2020, best estimates have that 25, possibly as many as 30 million people in each of those months in the middle of a global pandemic took to the streets. This is an image captured by the New York Times in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which of course is where the killing of George Floyd took place. But tens of millions of people, led by African Americans, but a diverse coalition of people, took to the streets, all ages, led by young people, but all ages or races or genders or sexualities, take to the streets, largest public protest in American history. And what people were calling for, as you all will recall, I'm sure many on this call right now, on this Zoom presentation here with us this evening, participated in those marches. And generally, people were calling for an end to or justice for the victims of police violence, which was clear. Accountability for those, or to hold accountable those who had committed these heinous crimes. That was one thing. There were also demands for recognition of Black humanity. This was manifest in those beautiful Black Lives Matter murals that dotted the American landscape from coast to coast, in the Midwest and the Southeast. Those beautiful murals that we saw people paint. There was also a call for an end to systemic racism. Now, this was different. Now, African Americans, as a part of the civil rights and the Black Power movement, have been calling for an end to systemic racism for decades. The language was sometimes different. Rather than systemic racism is much more of a 21st century term. You just call it structural racism, institutional racism, but the core idea was the same. Black folk have been calling for an end to the perpetuation of inequality as embedded in the systems and structures that govern our lives. And so that was part of what the call what people were clamoring for, right? And white folk were clamoring for in a way that we just simply hadn't seen before, calling out and calling for an end to systemic racism. But there was a fourth component to those protests, a fourth component that was really especially led by young people, by students. And that was the effort, the energy around removing monuments and symbols of white supremacy. Right now, this gets caught up certainly in the effort in the South and other places to remove Confederate monuments in Richmond, Virginia, for example, to remove the monuments to the secessionists, the leaders of the rebellion against the U.S., Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, and the like. But this was really important because as young people were calling for the removal of those monuments, what they were saying was that they were tired of being told a version of the past that did not actually occur. In other words, certainly there was a civil war, certainly there was a rebellion against the state, but it was done in the name of white supremacy. It was done to preserve the institution of slavery. And these symbols, these monuments, were in fact monuments to white supremacy. They were monuments to a history that was falsified and embodied in the lost cause mythology. And so that was really important because what our students were telling us is that they wanted us to do better by them, right? And in that is an opportunity that we hadn't seen before, where students had been, a lot had been going leading up to this, of course. March for Our Lives, Black Lives Matter students protesting, organizing around voter registration. So mass movement had been building, but to see it center around this call for an accurate account, an accurate telling of the past is extremely important because that's the opportunity. Our students were telling us, our kids were telling us that they wanted an accurate version of the past, that they wanted to learn about America's past so that they could make sense of America's present. That is absolutely critically important. And that was the opportunity, right? An opportunity that we hadn't seen literally for quite a few years in terms of the desire of students to have this accurate understanding of America's past so that they can make sense of America's present. Next slide, please. But with opportunities come obstacles. The fact that so many, tens of millions of young people, mostly white people, right, led by African Americans, led by people of color, but mostly white people, ain't that many Black people in America, mostly white people, calling for an end to systemic racism shook political conservatives to the core, especially elected officials, because there's really only two responses that you can have to a call to end systemic racism. One is to do something to change systems and structures, right? To change the way policing occurs, to change the way we fund policing, as an example, to change the laws that govern housing, for example. So you can actually respond by changing things. Or you can respond by doing nothing. You can respond by doubling down on preserving the status quo. And we have to be aware, we have to acknowledge, we have to say out loud that there are those who benefit from the existing status quo, even though that status quo can disenfranchise, can create harm, can perpetuate inequality for others. And so those who were benefiting from the prevailing status quo, even though that status quo perpetuated harm against others, their response to calls to end systemic racism was to do nothing. But in order to do nothing, they had to have a rationalization. They had to be able to justify that. And the way in which they justify that is by saying systemic racism isn't real. right? That racism embedded in the systems and structures of American society, political, economic, and social. Political, just in the way we gerrymander and allocate, and the fact that we really don't have one person, one vote in America, that we make it more difficult for people with disabilities or the elderly or the poor to gain access to polling places. These things, the way in which we perpetuate inequality in systems and structures, these political conservatives were like, that ain't real. Don't believe your eyes. Don't believe what's being told. And then they go a step further, because the anti-critical race theory, this is when we begin to hear all this, anti-critical race theory nonsense. And the image on the screen right now is a photo of the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, who of course has been leading the charge in terms of government officials against these supposed divisive issues. Essentially what they're saying is, we're not going to talk about the Black experience. We're not going to offer a critique of American society. We're just going to leave it alone and pretend as though it didn't happen. And the way in which they're able to animate people, to get people behind them, people that they thought they may have lost when the former president of the United States lost, to keep them engaged in electoral politics and behind them, was to then manufacture this political hysteria around critical race theory, right? And critical race theory, just as a point of reference, critical race theory is nothing more than a framework for understanding America's past and present that simply says we must take race and racism seriously when trying to understand America's past and present. That's it. Ain't that complicated, all right? You can go to law school and learn about it, but it ain't that complicated. Take race seriously and racism seriously when you're looking at America's past and present. That's all it is. None of this other nonsense about teaching little white children to hate themselves and hate America. All that is just nonsense, right? It's not happening. Nobody's teaching it. Don't worry about it, right? But it's designed to create this political hysteria so that those who benefit from the existing status quo that discriminates against other folk, that perpetuates inequality, so that they can keep doing the same things that they have been doing all along. And that becomes the obstacle of the moment. That's the obstacle that is pushing back against that opportunity, that energy that was created in the summer of 2020 around this terrible, tragic incident that occurred in Minneapolis and so many other places. And so when we think about how to teach the history of America, when we think about how to teach about the institution of slavery in America and beyond, and the way in which African Americans survived and fought back to transform this nation, transform the world, make America a little bit more like a democracy that it professed to be, then we have to think about, how do we get around the political reality of the moment, right? And that is not just what's happening in one state in Florida, but we see so many state legislatures that have introduced these bills designed to silence and make it more difficult for people to teach history accurately and effectively. Next slide, please. Why do we do this? Why do people fall for this? Why do people go along for these efforts to ban books saying that are exploring America's past in an accurate way, in an honest way? Why do we do this? A friend of mine, literary performer out of Boston, someone I greatly admire, Reggie Gibson, he said that we as Americans hate history. He said, we as Americans hate history. Hit the button for me, please, for the next little click there. He said, we hate history. He said, what we love is nostalgia. He said, we as Americans hate history. What we love is nostalgia. We love stories about the past that make us feel comfortable in the present. Don't matter if it's true or not, as long as the story makes us feel comfortable. See, that ain't history, right? That's nostalgia, right? That's stories about the past that may or may not have been true, right? It's a fictionalized version of the past. It's Disney's version of the past, right? That's nostalgia, and it doesn't do us any good. So we have to be clear that when we're going, what we want to teach, those of myself and so many others who are committed, and I'm sure like you wouldn't be on this call if you weren't committed to this as well. What we want to teach is history. We don't want to play around with the nostalgia, right? I mean, that doesn't serve anybody. Doesn't do our students any good. So why do we need to actually teach history and teach it honestly and effectively? Next slide, please. Anytime I look for philosophical answers, I turn to James Baldwin. And James Baldwin wrote, "We are our history. We are our history." Why do we have to teach the story of the American journey? The good and the bad, the easy and the difficult, the parts where we see love and the parts where we see hate, because that's who we are. That all of that is in our DNA. It informs how we engage. It tells us how we got here. We cannot wrestle with the problems and confront the problems of the present if we don't understand how they were created in the past in the first place. This is just who we are. For better or for worse, it is what we have inherited and what we have to deal with. We are our history. Now, we also know, in an effort to not deal with history the way it actually happened, that we have seen dramatized and most clear in the state of Florida, this rejection of the College Board's new proposed AP course on African American studies. Now, we don't have time to go into the details of what this attack is and what it's for. It's enough to say that it really represents this desire not to deal with the African or African American past. Because when you deal with the African/African American past, then you're provided a window into the American past that allows you to see things not only differently, but sometimes more clearly. It allows you to see through the haze and the clouds that have been created to blur the reality of America's past and the ways in which it continues to not just inform, but also haunt us in the present. And so what I want to do for the next few minutes is to look at some of the artwork that's on display in the Afro-Atlantic Histories exhibition at LACMA, and look at it and to see how, and talk a little bit about how it actually provides us this view into the past that would serve us greatly as teachers, as citizens, but would also serve our students so well. Because we as teachers have to prepare them for the future, right? I mean, that's what our task is. Make sure they understand the past so they can make sense of the present, to do what? So they can solve the problems of the future, the problems that we are leaving them with. That's our charge as educators. And African American studies, exploring the African American past, both the tough parts, the points of struggle, but also leaning into the points of hope. That's the way we can benefit. And this exhibition powerfully provides us the tools, really, with which we can use to make this history and the importance of this history clear to our students. Next slide, please. This is a piece by Hank Willis Thomas called "A Place to Call Home," featured in the Afro-Atlantic Histories exhibition. Whenever we're talking about the African-American experience, whenever we're talking about slavery in America, to be sure, but the Black experience in America, we often, now, we got a lot of people upset over 1619, a lot of white people upset over 1619. Ain't nothing but a damn date, right? It's 1619. Why is that important? Because 1619 marks the year when 29 Negroes, as the manifest said, were brought into Virginia, Fort Comfort, Virginia, Angolans, enchained and sold into slavery in British North America, in what would become America. This was an important moment because from that moment forward, the British colonists, the one day Americans, white Americans, had a choice to make, and they chose slavery over freedom, right? And they chose to base what would become the national economy, right, on some aspect of participating in the sale and purchase and work of enslaved people, right? So 1619 certainly is important. But when we're thinking about the Black experience and you want to teach about slavery in America, I understand that you don't have, there's always limits to the amount of time that we can spend in the classroom on a particular topic, but we can't just begin with 1619. We have to begin in Africa, right? And this piece by Hank Willis Thomas, is demonstrating, right, this connection between America, the Americas, and we have to throw the Caribbean and really even Latin America into South America in as well, but certainly in the context of African America, it's connecting African America to Africa itself, right? And so when we begin, we have to begin with Africa in some way, shape, or form. That is important because slavery is a political condition, right? And so in 1619, those 20 and odd Angolans who are brought over here in chains, their life did not begin when their feet hit the soil of Virginia, right? Their life began on the continent of Africa. They are put in chains, right? Journeyed across the Atlantic and sold into slavery here. But if we just begin the story here, we don't accurately capture their humanity, right? We're starting with their status. We don't want to start with their status. We want to start with their humanity because the institution of slavery does everything, including not only the social aspects of it, but the political aspects of it as well, are designed to rob Black people of their humanity. And so, there's always language issues, right? And people talking about language, we're not going to talk about slaves, we're talking about enslaved people. But in the same way we do that to recognize slavery as a status, as opposed to a condition or a state of being, a political status as opposed to a state of being, the same thing with the continent of Africa, right? We want to dig into the cultural production of the continent of Africa, not to say that, oh, that happened there and now this is here, but they bring all that with them, as we'll see in some of the exhibition pieces later on. African Americans, people of African descent, never shed their Africanity, if you will, right? It will look a little different, it will change over time, but it's all rooted in the same. So this piece by Hank Willis Thomas really, I think, captures this idea. It's like you can't talk about African Americans without talking about Africa. You can talk about America, to be sure, that's the political context in which Black people find themselves in, but it's the cultural context, it's the cultural heritage that African Americans bring with them. They don't arrive as empty vessels. They bring that with them. It informs how they live. It enables them to survive. And so we have to always keep in mind, if we just start when we can, even if you don't even have time to go into great depth and detail, you just say, look, Black people, African Americans, Africa, make sure you understand that, right? At least at minimum, you have to do that. Next slide, please. This is a powerful piece by Betty Saar called "I'll Bend, But I Will Not Break." I'll bend, but I will not break. And if you can lay your eyes on this, and I have another image that zooms in a little bit closer, but this is a mixed media piece. It has a vintage ironing board, a flat iron hooked to a chain to the ironing board, and then a white bed sheet behind it. And if you look very closely, you'll see along the seam, the right seam of the bed sheet, the three initials KKK, a rope connecting, holding up the bed sheet in the background. I like this piece, and I wanted to share it with you or draw your attention to it here because it does a lot of different things that are connected to the Black experience in slavery and carrying through in freedom. The first is this idea of the ironing board, right? It conjures up these notions of labor, right? Certainly domestic labor, but just labor in general. And that's really important because our students need to understand that the institution of slavery was first and foremost a system to extract labor from African people, right? It's a system to extract labor from African people. African people were not put into bondage. African Americans were not held in bondage simply because their skin was dark, right? Simply because of racism. racism, a belief in white supremacy, to be more precise, was a rationalization, a justification for the treatment and exploitation of African people, right? That's a rationalization, justification. The purpose for the system of holding people in bondage was to extract their labor, right? And thinking about the work that you have to put into an ironing board and domestic labor, right, really speaks to that labor. Now, certainly all the labor that African people did, enslaved African people did, wasn't confined to domestic duties, this we know, right? I mean, they're working crops, sugar, tobacco, cotton, rice. They are in every possible industry. They're blacksmiths, they're wheelwrights, they're working on ships, but it's labor, 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 labor. So it is so critically important that our students understand that this was an economic system that was derived and designed to extract physical labor from African Americans for the purpose of generating profits, not only for those who are holding them in bondage, the enslavers, but also for companies, corporations, and countries, right? Companies, corporations, and countries. And so there's a purpose to this process, a purpose to this labor. I also like the fact that the sheet is there. If you're thinking about domestic work, you're thinking about sort of what the work of an ironing board and what you do when you're ironing. You're ironing. What would you be ironing? And you have this bed sheet, but then the clan initials, right? And to me, that invoke this idea that behind the labor, what made the labor, what made African people labor, right, was the perpetual threat of terror, right? And that cannot be understated at all, that violence was the absolute cornerstone of the institution of slavery. And it was an everyday violence. You know, it's after Reconstruction that, or after the Civil War, that we see the rise of terror organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. But the Ku Klux Klan was drawing on a tradition of terror and violence that was the cornerstone of the institution of slavery. And so to have that as sort of the backdrop, laboring with this threat, this ominous threat of violence, to me really speaks to an aspect of the institution of slavery that exists in colonial America and certainly in the early United States for 2.5 centuries. That behind it all, what made the system work, what compelled Black people to labor, was violence, a physical violence, the terror that we would imagine, but also, you know, the violence of family separation, the sexual violence that was visited upon African Americans. So our students have to understand, in age-appropriate ways, of course, that fear and violence was really what kept this system going. And the next slide, please. And the next slide is a shot of the top of the ironing board, and it's an image that many of us have seen before. It's the diagram of a transatlantic slave vessel in which the human cargo is laid out. It's the tight packing system that was designed by European kidnappers and enslavers for putting as many human bodies into the hull of a slave ship as possible for the 30-day, 60-day, sometimes 90-day voyage across the Atlantic into the Caribbean, into South America, into Central America, and into North America. And there's an aspect of the past when thinking about slavery that we can't ignore. And it really is captured certainly in the Middle Passage. And that is the trauma, right? And the trauma of being at so many different stages and phases. The trauma of the kidnap on the coast, on the interior of the continent. The trauma of being shackled and dragged to the coast from the interior, which could be, it could be weeks, it could be months, it could be a year in this transit from the interior of the continent to the coast. The trauma of the Middle Passage itself, being held in the hold of the ship, the trauma of being sold in North America or in the Americas, the trauma of being forced to work on a sugar plantation in Barbados or a rice plantation in South Carolina or a tobacco plantation in Virginia, the trauma of being separated and sold again in the Americas. After the transatlantic slave trade is finally banned in the United States in 1808, there is a domestic slave trade, a domestic traffic in which those who were held in bondage in the northern states like Virginia and Maryland, in the upper South states like Virginia and Maryland, are then sold into the South, into the deep South, into the expanding South, into the growing cotton South of Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas, and Arkansas, and these places. There's that trauma as well. We're talking about 1 million people were Black folk were forcibly separated from family and friends and sold in this domestic slave trade. So one of the things that has to be conveyed is that African Americans were suffering this traumatic experience for 2.5 centuries, right? And that certainly has an impact on their well-being. That has an impact on their life and livelihood. And we have to seriously consider the way in which that will impact people over the generations, right? And so trauma, this traumatic experience, is something that kids have to know existed. Now, one thing we're not going to do, we're not doing recreation, right? Nobody's going to say, hey, let's all lay out on the floor and see if we can, replicate, sort of tight packing. No, we're not going to do that. We don't trivialize, we don't traumatize, right? So it's enough for them to in their mind's eye, right, understand. And as they grow older, they'll become clear about, sort of these traumatic experiences and how it can impact a person's life. But the trauma was real. And at the same time, we have to understand that African Americans, despite the trauma, are still able to hold on to their humanity, are still able to build family, are still able to love one another and love themselves, right? I mean, so they're able to live with this trauma. I don't know if you ever overcome such a traumatic experience, but they're able to live with the trauma. And in that are still able to create so many wonderful aspects of Black culture that will influence not just America, but the world itself. So we want to remember the labor, that this is a system of labor. But we also want to remember that it's enforced by racial terrorism and racial violence. And we want to remember that this is a traumatic experience, right? Arguably one of the most traumatic experiences in human history. The next slide, please. Many will be familiar, if not necessarily, with this particular Ernest Cricklow portrait, but painting. But this is Harriet Tubman, Sister Harriet, right? Sister Harriet Tubman. I love this. I wanted to highlight and draw our attention to this portrait of Harriet Tubman because Harriet Tubman is the embodiment of the spirit of resistance, right? And resistance in the African American, when teaching about slavery and freedom, resistance is so critically important. In fact, I contend, especially for young people, elementary school and middle school to be sure, that when you want to teach about the institution of slavery, you have to lead with resistance. You have to lead with people like Harriet Tubman. You have to lead with people like Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser, right? You have to lead with resistance. Even if you haven't even talked about what they're resisting, it's enough to say they're resisting the institution of slavery. You have to lead with resistance. Why? Because resistance is the response to harm, right? Resistance is the response to captivity. Resistance is the response to injustice. And what students will do is they will look for the resistance to, if you're saying this is unjust, then why didn't people fight back? And that allows them, it's the resistance that allows them to connect to the humanity of people that they would otherwise not be able to connect to. Because in their minds, they're like, oh, I would never tolerate that. I would do X, Y, and Z, even if they don't understand the complexity of resistance. So you lead with resistance. This is Harriet Tubman. Let me tell you what Harriet Tubman did. See how much of a badass Harriet Tubman was, right? You lead with resistance so they can connect to the humanity. And then you complicate it to be sure, right? I mean, there's different modes of resistance. I mean, there's the outright flight of freedom seekers like Harriet Tubman going back and forth into Maryland to rescue family and so many others. There's the subtle acts of resistance that never really become public. It's liberating food and burning crops and burning warehouses and all types of things, all types of ways, learning to read and write and sharing information and knowledge. I mean, there's a spectrum of resistance that we then can complicate, but we have to lead with resistance. We have to make it clear to our students that, they'll say, well, why didn't Black people rebel? It's like, okay, Black people did rebel, enslaved people did rebel. They rebel quite often, right? There's hundreds of possibilities, conspiracies, and the like, so many. But the number one goal of people who were enslaved was to stay alive. They were not suicidal. And rebellion, outright rebellion in the United States was suicidal. It was absolutely suicidal. You weren't going to succeed, right? You could, if you were on a plantation, you could take out the white people who were enslaving you. You could take out, the white folk on your plantation, 7 or 8 people. Nat Turner did that real quick. Boom, boom, gone. You can take out a couple of neighbors, spread out a few miles down the road. Got it. Boom, gone. But eventually, you're going to have to deal with the armed white men in the county. Then you're going to have to deal with the officially organized county militia. And if somehow you got past the county militia, you're going to have to deal with the state militia. And if you got past the state militia, you're going to have to deal with the U.S. Army. You're going to have to deal with the federal government that was coming down to put down enslaved insurrections, uprisings. And so African Americans understood this. They absolutely understood the odds were stacked against them, and their primary goal was to survive. So we don't want to reduce resistance to whether or not you fought, you took up arms in rebellion or not. We want to look at resistance in its full complexity, the ways in which African Americans challenge their status. And to me, that is certainly embodied in Harriet Tubman. But we also want to go beyond the Harriet Tubman, because the risk of just focusing on a singular person is then we say, oh, well, she must have been the exception. Now, she was an exceptional woman, but she wasn't the exception in terms of resisting the institution of slavery. Next slide, please. One of the things that we have to be clear about is that resistance had consequences, and challenging the status quo had consequences. This is an etching by Carol Walker that she labeled restraint. And this etching is of one of the sort of heinous concoctions that enslavers came up with to punish habitual offenders, freedom seekers who constantly, or African people who constantly try to seek their freedom. And you attach these devices with bells and harnesses to that weighed heavy so that they could not, if they attempted to escape, if they attempted to run away, they wouldn't be able to go far. I wanted to draw our attention to this because too often when we talk about the institution of slavery and what Black folk had to deal with, it becomes almost, we think of it as being linear, right? That African Americans may have responded, but things kind of always get a little better. And we don't look at the consequences of the efforts of people who attempt to get free, a literal freedom, and fail, right? I mean, there are risks involved, there are consequences involved, and there are people who are determined to keep Black folk in chains, right? And when you do something like this, you're demonstrating a desire to keep Black people in chains, right? And so it's that response rooted in sort of a devilish inhumanity that we can't ignore. We do a lot in the public to sanitize those who kept Black people in bondage, right? And actually, we condition our children to be sympathetic towards enslavers, to identify with enslavers. Right? We say, well, one of the obstacles that we're now facing is, well, if you want to talk about the institution of slavery, you want to talk about the hard aspects of America's past, let's not do it with young children, right? Let's wait until they're in high school or perhaps even college. But we don't wait to do that when we're teaching our children to identify with enslavers. We're coming up on Monday, we have President's Day. And what are we going to do? We're going to celebrate American presidents. And we're going to talk about how wonderful Thomas Jefferson was, and how wonderful George Washington was, how wonderful James Madison, architect of the Constitution, was, right? And we're not going to talk about them, all of them believing in white supremacy. We're not going to talk about those presidents in particular, those early colonial founding fathers, if you will. We're not going to talk about them as enslavers who would do exactly this to any person who repeatedly tried to seek their freedom. There's the wonderful work and book on Ona Judge, and a young African-American enslaved girl who fled George Washington, and George Washington putting in advertisements, runaway advertisements, seeking to get her returned, seeking to bring this child back to labor for him for free. And then when she was older in the 1830s, long after Washington had died, they said, well, she was being interviewed, and they said, well, why didn't you want to stay, right? And or even go back? This is George Washington, this is the father of the country. And she was like, are you stupid, right? He was like, why would I want to stay there with somebody who's trying to keep my freedom from me, right? And so it all becomes about perspective. But this idea that there were people who were active in this, right, trying to keep, actively trying to hold people in bondage, enslavers, not just slave owners, enslavers, is critically important. And this particular image of the restraint really drew my attention to that particular fact. Next slide, please. There's a lot of trauma when talking about the African-American experience. There's a lot of trauma when talking about the institution of slavery, that Middle Passage, the kidnapping, the forced sales and separation, the sexual violence, the sheer brutality of it. But there's also a lot of joy, right? And this depiction by Charles White of gospel singers really spoke to two aspects, right? One, the joy, and I'll say a little bit more about that with the next image. But then also this idea of the deep spirituality of African Americans, of African people, right? That often found its expression through music, right? And particularly through gospel music, right? Through hymns, through those old spirituals, right? Work songs transformed into spirituals. So one of the things that is one of the great ways, effective ways to teach about both slavery and freedom, and to center the humanity of Black folk and the ways in which they capture that humanity and sing about that humanity, the way in which they love one another, which carries them through, is through music, right? It's through the songs that they sing, the way they sing them, how they sing them, how they're able to feel. So it's not just about the lyrics, right? It's about feeling. I don't know how many of you may have seen the powerful movie 12 Years a Slave, which is a film that I show my students, age appropriate. Middle school probably could deal with it, high school for sure. I wouldn't show it to elementary students. A little bit too much violence in there. But there's a scene in there, for those who have seen it, where the lead character, Solomon Northup, who is stolen and kidnapped from New York, Schenectady, New York, and sold into slavery into Mississippi and Louisiana. And there's a scene in there where members of the community, one of the enslaved people, an elder, dies, and they're having a very short funeral. They buried him, and they gathered around the body, or his burial plot, and they begin to sing "Roll, Jordan, Roll." And Solomon Northrop, who had just sort of entered that particular community, having been sold from someplace else, was just sort of very sort of present. But the more they sing, the more he is actually drawn into the community, the more he feels the pain, but he also feels the connection to those who he finds in this similar situation and circumstance. And you can see it on his face. And as he begins to sing Roll, Jordan, Roll in that particular moment, you see the power of song. I mean, that was a song that I had heard sung in my church, a Baptist church in Brooklyn, New York, growing up. But it wasn't until I saw it in that context that I truly understood the power of singing that song in that context and what it would mean to generations of people over the years. And so this particular piece of artwork really captures, I think, some of that beauty for a later period. But it really reflects that we're going to talk about the institution of slavery. We're going to talk about enslaved people. We also have to talk about the ways in which they find joy, the ways in which they're able to connect to one another. And it's in the archival record, for example, in the archaeological record, excuse me, in James Madison's Montpelier. This is the plantation and state slave labor camp that James Madison, the fourth president of the United States, had. He enslaves over 100 people over the course of his lifetime, never frees a single soul. 300 people are held in bondage to the Madisons over the course of 100 or so years. But the archaeologists working down there, when they look in the quarters of the enslaved folk, they find all kinds of things. They find marbles and little trinkets that kids would have been playing with, right? So even though these kids are made to labor to build the bricks that build these plantation estates, they still are able to carve out time, right, to be children, to be themselves as much as possible. It's not a lot, but it's just enough to maintain their humanity. And we got to make sure that our kids understand that, our students understand that. Next slide, please. And this piece, I wanted to highlight as well, entitled "Musicians," really speaks to that joy, right? That African people, African Americans coming out of slavery, in slavery, will still find. The cultural inheritance of the drum, and how that remains one of the central figures, central features, central instruments of the African diaspora. And we find these elements of the African diaspora: the dance, the song, the drumming, the music, the movement, not just here in the American context, but one of the beautiful things in Afro-Atlantic, we see it in Brazil, we see it in South America, we see it in the Caribbean, we see it in Central America, and it really reinforces this notion that what we're talking about is a transnational system, but we're also talking about the African diaspora, right? I mean, the only difference between me being born in America and someone being born in Brazil is where the ship landed, where the wind blew some 250, 300 years, 400 years ago. And that's it, right? Otherwise, we'd be in different places, but we'd be the same people, still folk of African descent. So we want to make sure that people understand that this isn't about the privilege of being born in this country in the quote unquote new world, or that country in the quote unquote new world. It was just the simply fate connected to where your people were captured and where they were sold, and that was it. So we have more in common thinking about the African diaspora. Black folk in Brooklyn and Barbados have more in common than they don't, and it has everything to do with this African cultural inheritance, which is very much captured in this image here. Next slide, please. Many of you will be familiar with this. The "I Am a Man" placards and signs that sanitation workers wore in Memphis, Tennessee. My 7-year-old daughter, by the way, I was preparing these slides, and she looked over my shoulder and she read the sign and said, "I am a man." And she said, well, I am a woman. I was like, oh my God. It's like, yes, there's a context to this though. She was like, that's not fair. I had to do it anyway. We're working on that, right? She had a point, but I had to create the context for her. She understands the context. Anyway, so I am a man, but also I am a woman, right? It really reflects the long durée of the struggle for freedom, right? And so this is 1968. In the winter and spring of 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, where African American sanitation workers, we go on strike after 2 of their number are killed or crushed to death in the back of a sanitation truck because they were not allowed as African Americans to sit in the cabin during inclement weather. They were not allowed to take the day off during inclement weather, and they were paid, literally starvation wages, not enough to feed their family, denied medical benefits. So when these sanitation workers go on strike, they're declaring, I am a man that's saying, look, you got to recognize our humanity. And by extension, as my 7-year-old daughter has rightly pointed out, right? This is also, I am a woman. We are people, right? This is what they're saying. You need to recognize our humanity and the struggle behind it. So it's not just a call for recognition, but in the classroom, we got to make sure that our students understand that the struggle for a literal freedom that we saw during the institution of slavery is connected to the struggles that we see going on in the 1960s and 1970s, the civil rights and Black Power era, but then also connected to the struggles that we see going on today under the banner of Black Lives Matter, what we saw in the summer of 2020. It belongs on a continuum. This desire to have Black humanity recognized, but also to secure those basic civil rights and human rights that all people are entitled to. So this recreation, this painting of that iconic symbol, that iconic sign of the 1968 strike, to me really reminds us that we have to locate the African American freedom struggle on a continuum. Next slide. I want to run through just a couple quick sort of do's and don'ts, drawing on some of these images, some of the artwork that is featured at the museum that I just shared with you, and then I'll open it up for some conversation and discussion. If we are teaching slavery and freedom, if we're teaching slavery and freedom, there's a couple things that we need to do. First, there we go. We're gonna do this, right? I'm not clicking, but we're gonna do this. We got a rhythm going on. All right. So first, you got to make clear to your students that race is not real. Like, this is really important. We just talked about African American, we talked about African people and all this other stuff, but the reality is that race is not real. Race is biologically meaningless. It's biologically meaningless. It's not real, but race is socially meaningful. Race not real, biologically meaningless, but race is socially meaningful. And that's really important for students to understand, because if they think that race is real and not a social construct that is relevant because it's created hierarchy and continues to perpetuate inequality, then they will default back to racial stereotypes to explain the world around them. Let me say that again. If they think that race is real, they will default back to racial stereotypes, almost all negative, in order to explain the world around them. And they will not look at systems and structures and the ways in which the world creates inequality, sometimes purposefully, and they will suddenly default back to this understanding, or default back to negative stereotypes, and the blame for inequality then falls on the shoulders of the victims of discrimination, right? So our students have to understand day one that race isn't real, so they won't fall back on that. That's point one. Point two, if race isn't real, racism is real, right? And so this is challenging those notions of those who want to preserve the status quo and who have been saying that systemic racism isn't real. It's a fiction of our imagination, right? And then now they're willing to go. They're willing to go as far as saying, well, racism certainly existed in the past, but it no longer exists today, not in a systemic way, right? And it's like, all right, if anybody ever tells you that, then just simply say, well, when did it end? Give me a date. I'm a historian. I like dates. If racism, systemic racism existed, if that's the institution of slavery, if that was Jim Crow, tell me when it ended. And they can't tell you because they know it didn't, because there's no date, right? We're still living with the consequences of that. So teaching this slavery and freedom, race is not real, but racism is real. And it manifests itself both in individual ways, in the personal prejudice, but also in systemic and structural ways as well. So we want to make sure our students understand systems and structures. Point three, the story of the African American past, and we're talking about the institution of slavery, and the transition to freedom, we have to make clear that this is a struggle for what I call freedom rights. African Americans, prior to emancipation, are fighting for a literal freedom from the institution of slavery. They're fighting for abolition, both those who are in bondage, the 4 million or so by 1860, but also African Americans who were already free, because they understood, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, they understood that their basic rights, civil rights and human rights, what I call freedom rights, their basic rights were in jeopardy, were constantly under threat. Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, you could be kidnapped and sold back into slavery. That as long as slavery existed, their freedom was at risk. So they're fighting for a literal freedom. And then after emancipation, African Americans for the last 150 years have been fighting to secure and protect their basic civil rights and human rights, right? Again, freedom rights based upon their experiences in slavery. And so when we talk about the institution of slavery, we're talking about slavery and freedom, we do want to talk about resistance, but it's resistance not just for the individual to get free. It's this broader sense of creating freedom for all people, right? Freedom for African Americans, but then expanding those basic civil rights and human rights to all people. So our students have to understand that this is a fight, this is a struggle to secure these rights that is many centuries old. Next, point 4. The principal legacy of the institution of slavery is white supremacy. Slavery ends, slavery is abolished with the Civil War, but the ideology that undergirds the institution is not. And so white supremacy becomes the principal legacy of the institution of slavery and serves as the rationalization and justification for racial discrimination going forward. So the rationalization for legal segregation is white supremacy. The rationalization for the war on drugs is white supremacy. The rationalization for mass incarceration is white supremacy. And so that remains the principal legacy. We ended slavery, but we did not end this belief in white supremacy. And we must also recognize that what is that legacy isn't just sort of a legacy by default or legacy in the background. Racism is the most powerful political organizing tool that America has ever created, and white supremacy in particular. And so its mobilization to provide a justification for actions and behavior that harms others is still very much alive with us today. Point 5, violence. Thinking about that, the image of the restraint, thinking about that the ironing board and the Klan, violence is the cornerstone of slavery. Violence is also the cornerstone of freedom. Violence enabled Jim Crow to exist as a system, an economic system to exploit Black labor for more than 100 years. Violence has been the way we have policed Black bodies, literal police doing that, but then also more generally by the society as a whole. So we cannot escape. I mean, this is the lynching, for example, but then also how does that connect to the violence that we see against Black bodies and Black people today? More people, 3 times as many people today die at the hands of police on a yearly basis than died at the hands of lynch mobs during the height of lynching 100 years ago. So we're still dealing with violence as central to the system of controlling Black labor and regulating Black behavior. Point 6, this reinforcing simply that we can't just focus on individual bad behavior. We have to focus on the intersection and the interplay of systems and structures. And point 7, when teaching slavery and freedom, there is hope. This is hard history. This is difficult history. It's hard to talk about. It's hard to make sense of sometimes for our kids. And my students will accuse me. They're like, Dr. Jeffries, halfway through the semester, like, Dr. Jeffries, this is a good class, but man, I'm depressed, right? I was like, you should be a little bit depressed. This history is difficult, man. It's American history. You shouldn't be walking through American history like it's, I was about to curse. You shouldn't be walking through American history like it's Disneyland, right? Like this is some stuff. This is some stuff, some tough stuff. But within that, there is hope. But the hope isn't in, the fact that that the nation overcame and pushed beyond certain things. No, those things that have been accomplished have been the result of people who have been willing to fight and sacrifice and willing to lose their lives, right, to provide or to secure these basic civil rights and human rights for people, to expand democracy, to give meaning to the words that were put on parchment during the time of the American Revolution. The hope is in the struggle. The hope is in knowing, and our kids have to understand this, that the hope of the Black experience and the Black past is that there have always been people who have been willing to fight for freedom, who have been willing to sacrifice their lives, the lives of their families, their livelihoods, to secure basic civil rights and human rights, not just for themselves, but for everyone, right? In that idea is where we need to hang our hat, where we need our students to lean into, right? Because it is difficult to study the past, but when you see that hope, when you learn about the Harriet Tubman who never gave up, right? People always willing to fight. The sanitation workers always willing to fight. The kids in the summer of 2020 who are willing to go out and face hyper militarized police and not turn around, right? There's always hope because somebody's has demonstrated that they've always been willing to fight for freedom. Next slide. A couple key points, and then I'll throw it open for teachers who are teaching slavery and freedom, what we need to be doing in the classroom in particular. The first thing is, so point one, we don't want to trivialize and we don't want to traumatize. We don't want to trivialize the subject, and by making fun, right? By doing little light things like, hey, let's play with cotton. Hey, let's not, right? And we don't want to traumatize, right? We don't want to do these recreations because you can't recreate the horror of the institution of slavery. And if you could actually do it, you would wind up in jail, right? So we want to move away from those types of recreations. Now we can have sensible debates. We can recreate the Constitutional Convention and add Black people to it and say, well, what's the outcome if we actually consider, these different perspectives, right? I mean, so there's ways to discuss and talk about, but we want to be mindful not to trivialize or to traumatize. Second point, you got to know your classroom. You have to know the students in your classroom, which means you got to know which students, when you're entering into these subjects, talking about slavery and freedom, talking about race and racism, you have to know which students to protect, and you got to be willing to do it. Somebody says something stupid, you got to go in, shut it down. You got to know which students to protect. You're not going to allow students to turn and look at that one Black student. I mean, so you got to know which students you need to protect. You need to know also which students that you need to correct, right? So that means you can't let students get away with certain stuff in the classroom, right? And you got to know who's going to say something crazy in advance so that you can intercede and shut it down, right? So you got to know which students to protect as well as which students to correct. That's all a part of knowing your classroom. Point three, you got to know yourself. You got to, and you have to be able to share who you are with the classroom, right? With your students. And by that, I mean, one, your racial identity. We're talking about race and racism. You can't play around and act like you don't have a racial identity in this world. Lara began by saying and describing, like, yeah, I'm a white woman, I got curly hair. Like, yeah, I'm a Black guy, I got no hair, right? So we want to make sure, because what you actually do in that is you give your students permission to have conversation about their own racial identity and what it means, right? And so we rather than conditioning our children not to talk about what is so obvious, we say, no, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with talking about race and racism if you're not having conversations that are rooted in stereotype and you're not using or discriminate against people, right? And so knowing yourself also means being able to share with your students those moments where you got stuff wrong, where you were using wrong language, where you were using terminology that was insufficient, that was doing more harm than good, and that you corrected yourself, right? That you learned, that you did better, you listened, right? Because what you're doing is you're giving your students permission to listen and learn too. You're also giving them permission to be wrong and then to learn. Because we have to do as much unlearning when it comes to these issues as we have to do learning. And by sharing that experience with of your own experience, you're giving permission to your students to embark on this journey as well. Point four. This is old civil rights organizing point. You got to start where the students are, right? You can't go into a classroom. Every year when I go into the classroom, I got to figure out, okay, now who are my kids? Who are my students? Where are they? What do they know? Sometimes they are not where I want them to be, and sometimes they're beyond who I am. It's like, oh, I thought I was radical. Like, y'all ready for revolution? Okay, I got to move the conversation and shift it over there. And so knowing where your students are and where they're coming from is critically important because that enables you to reach them. You may use different metaphors. You may use different analogies. You may use different primary sources. It all depends on where your students are, right? And the only way you're gonna know where they are is if you engage with them in conversation, right? Ask them what they know, what have they heard, what do they think? Give them permission, again, within the context of both correcting and protecting, but you're giving them permission to share what they know so that you can start where they are and build from there. Point 5, you want to teach in universals. We're dealing with these obstacles, the Ron DeSantis's and all these other people, right, who are claiming we're doing things in the classroom that we aren't. So, okay, let's forget about trying to win a debate about critical race theory. That has been hijacked. Let scholars and academia, Kimberly Crenshaw is more than capable of defending and explaining and articulating what this is, because they're actually not trying to debate the issue. They're just trying to disparage the topic, right? They're trying to disparage the subject. So don't even deal with that. When they ask you what you're teaching about democracy, right? You're teaching civics. You're teaching you're teaching about good governance, right? I mean, these are the things that we're doing anyway, but we can't get trapped we're thinking about citizenship, right? And what does it mean? The motto for the Ohio State University is education for citizenship. So what are you teaching over there at Ohio State? I'm teaching education for citizenship, right? I mean, so we want to use these universals to allow us to do the work that we need, that we're already doing and want to be able to continue to do. Point 6. I don't even know what this is. Oh yeah, lead with primary sources. This is so critical, right? So we want to provide, and the artwork at the exhibit, I mean, this is kind of a primary resource, right? We want to give students, we want to let the source material speak for itself, right? Our task isn't, to change minds per se, it's to open minds. And one of the ways that we can open minds is by allowing students to explore material, explore primary sources. That can be in the form of music, that can be in form of art, that can be in form of textual documents, right? And depending upon the age, of course, in age appropriate ways, we want them to engage this material because it also gives you some cover. And people say, oh, you hate the founding fathers and all this other stuff. The founders and framers, I don't need to pass judgment on them, right? You think they're racist. I don't think they're anything. You can read their own works. You ever read Thomas Jefferson, right? I don't got to call him a racist. He proudly declares he's one himself. Right. And so leading with the primary resources is so critically important, especially for older students as well as for parents on outside, because they're going to, they're coming in with their own baggage of this, that, and the other. And as an African-American teacher myself, right, I understand that they're coming in with a hesitancy based upon, some perceived bias that I might have. And so I let the primary documents speak for themselves, right, and allow them to interpret, to see what is so obvious to see, but then also to use other sources of the material, like the artwork presented at the museum, to do interpretation and some kind of analysis as well. And then finally, the last point, when thinking about dealing with those obstacles, and we know that parents, in this particular moment, politicized parents, politically conservative, hyper-politicized parents can be an obstacle towards teaching this history, not just accurately and effectively, but just simply teaching it. And one of the ways to deal with that is to engage parents in the work that we're doing early on. And this is important because parents can be allies. The one thing that we have on our side when teaching this history, the work that we're doing, whether it's in a college classroom, a kindergarten classroom, high school or middle school, or in an exhibit at a museum or historic site, is we're not the ones making stuff up, right? Like we're actually telling this history honestly and truthfully. So the fact that we're not making anything up, we don't have to make anything up. We have the historical and interpretive sources, on our side. Then why not share it? We don't have anything to hide. But what we do is you share it early. You invite these parents into the classroom. Now, I'm a parent. You don't want it there day to day, right? But you invite them in a general way. This is what I'm doing. This is why I'm doing it. And this is the aim and the goal, and this is the source material, and you're welcome to join along. You're welcome to follow along. Because what will happen is most parents will appreciate that. Okay, cool. I see what they're doing. I see what she's doing, right? And I love what she's doing. Go forth, keep going, keep my kid out of my hair, right? But then if you get the one or two parents who act up, then you have the other parents who are there to say, wait a minute, that's not what's going on. That's not what Miss So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so was doing in the classroom. I know what they were doing. So they actually become your ally, right? They become, because they know what's been going on. It's almost too late if you go to teachers after, parents after the fact, right? Because then they can get sucked into all of that nonsense that these other parents who don't want this history to be taught then wind up feeding them. So it's one of the ways in which we can seize the opportunity that students have created for us and wanting to know this history and get over the obstacle of parents politicizing what it is that we're actually doing in the classroom. And so with that, I will open it up for comments and questions and the like. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jeffries. That was wonderful. Your approach is so clear and dynamic and inspiring. It was just amazing the way that you wove the artworks together to create this history and reveal this history to us in all of its authenticity. So thank you so much for that. We would love to take questions from the audience. You can put them in the chat, or you can feel free to unmute yourselves. This is a time for discussion and to ask Dr. Jeffries anything you'd like.
Hi, this is Saleh. Have you ever encountered any of your students? I came in kind of around 30 minutes after, but the students that you teach, are they majority African American, white, Hispanic? What's your range?
Yes. So I teach at the Ohio State University, which is the flagship university in the state of Ohio. And Ohio State University is very, very white. Football team is very, very black, but Ohio State University is very, very white. And most of my classes, I teach African American history, civil rights movement, other courses of the site. And most of my classes will be majority white. If I have a class, of 90 students, if I get 20 students of color, I'm surprised just by the sheer numbers of the demographics. The smaller, Latino population at Ohio State, the numbers are growing, but it's still very small and negligible indigenous folk here. So the demographics definitely look different than they would in California, and depending upon the school level, and then they would in the East Coast. Now, but there are schools, of course, here in Columbus, Ohio, where we are, that are 90% Black, right? That are, large populations of Latinos. But my classrooms in particular, as a reflection of Ohio State, are overwhelmingly white. And there are a range of people too. I mean, the range of white folk, right? I mean, there's white kids from the suburbs, white kids from rural Ohio. So it makes for an interesting class discussion.
Okay, so my next question is, have you taught with the elementary school system?
So
but I have another question.
Okay.
To that. So if you have,
go ahead.
If you have, what, how do you handle when you may have a student that will, maybe they're being controversial and saying, it's a white student saying, well, is this true? You know what I mean? They kind of like question whatever it is that you're giving them. Well, and also with the black student too, or a minority student. So how do you handle that?
I think with any student, when you don't, it depends on where the student is coming from, and I think we have to. I mean, this is part of knowing the class, right? Is this a student who's genuinely asking a question out of curiosity, or is this a student who's just watching Fox News and repeating sort of talking points and is just trying to be disruptive? Right? Because one thing I like about college, I'll throw a student out in a hot second if they're just trying to be disruptive. But understanding where the student is coming from is really important. Sometimes if it's a student, especially when they're elementary school, right, they're a little younger, right, you can say, hey, okay, now why do you think this, right? And let's sort of walk through this. We don't want to get trapped. We might set some time aside separately. But with older students, one of the things, rather than getting sort of dragged into a debate, one of the things that you can do is simply, I ask questions. right? And the students who have had me for a long time at Ohio State, they know, or several classes, you get these repeat students, right? When somebody says something crazy in a class, and I begin with, "Oh, that's interesting," they start rolling their eyes like, "Oh hell, he about to light them up." But the next question is, what are you basing that on, right? Because going back to the sources, okay, here's my evidence. What are you basing? Oh, that's interesting. What are you basing that on? Well, I heard. Well, show me. Show me. I need you to show me, because whatever they're basing it on is usually silliness. It's usually not true, right? Or it's usually something that has been taken out of context. And so I just simply say, and we can do this with, this is one of the ways. Some of the things sometimes when dealing with questions or dealing with racist interactions, sometimes those of us, or any type of discriminatory action, we take the burden of proof on ourselves. Like I gotta prove my point, right? Like, no, you prove your point, and I guarantee you it's not gonna stand up to the challenge that I have, because I have the evidence that. And no matter what the age of the kid is, I mean, you're not gonna toss a kid who's in fourth grade out, but you're gonna say, if they're just bringing stuff from home, "Oh, that's interesting. Where are you getting that from?" Right? And "Oh, my brother." Like, "Oh yeah, all right. Well, tell your brother to provide us with some evidence so we can interrogate this in the class." Because one of the things that we have to teach our students in those moments is how to critically engage with information, to have critical analysis about information, especially when so much they're being bombarded with information constantly, and they have to be able to interrogate sources and develop a critical eye for sources. And those can become moments in which they do. But if the student is just being hostile for the sake of being hostile, then we got to shut that down, because then you're limiting the time. You're taking away from other students from the time in which they can learn.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
There was a question in the chat as to whether you have a book, Dr. Jeffries.
No, yeah. A couple things I think that might be worth checking out. A book that I wrote for teachers on teaching the civil rights movement that you had mentioned at the top when we had come together. It's called Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement, that draws upon, I served as the editor, and it brought together a number of wonderful scholars and practitioners about how to teach the history of the African American civil rights movement, literally dating from the era of slavery up into the present. So I would strongly recommend, if those who are interested, particularly as teachers, of taking a look at that.
Thank you. And we have Keisha Lamb has her hand raised. Do you want to come on?
Thank you. Professor Jeffries, you about to have me transfer to Ohio State, or wherever you're at. This was amazing. Thank you. My question is about the balance between correcting and protecting your Black students when teaching this narrative. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, it's critically important that we do that, right? And of course, it's it's usually about protecting Black students and students of color when it's about these conversations. And the protecting doesn't just come in a moment, right? Like you can't go 4 months in a class and then suddenly like, hey, today we're going to talk about Black people, right? Because you just set, if you're in a class and you've got a handful of Black folk, you just set those Black folk up to be targets, right? And so you don't want to do that. So you want to build this relationship where you're incorporating this history into the curriculum from day one. So when you dig down and deeply into difficult subjects, and it becomes particularly difficult, if you're doing it with any real sense of purpose, it will get difficult. Then those students don't feel as though suddenly all eyes are on them, right? So the protection is about how are the students incorporated into the classroom from the very beginning. If they're just, if they're literally a numerical minority in that classroom. But then it's also when the conversation turns, right? We don't want to put the burden of, speaking for the race onto kids who are just trying to learn too. And that's part of that protection. But the protection also extends into the correction. So if you have some white kids or somebody, even some other Black kids, it doesn't matter who it is, somebody says something crazy, right? Then that has to be shut down, right? Whether it was purposeful or intentional or unintentional, right? Because you cannot allow, or students have to realize that this is your classroom, you are in control, and that stuff is just simply not going to fly. but it's done in a way that does not shut down the broader sense of conversation, right? Because it's okay to be, you want students to be wrong in the classroom, right? Because that's how they learn, but we don't want them to be hurtful in the classroom. And so there is a fine line, and only you as the teacher in that classroom can really judge, okay, what can be said and understood, and where do I have to, and what can be said that needs me to immediately jump in the moment.
I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we also have a hand from Arlene Weinstock.
Hello, I want to thank you first for the most wonderful speech because it was very specific. So often people talk in generalities, but I love that you gave teachers and those of us that work with kids just such specific approaches. The one question I have is very short, is do you think it's better to use the term enslaved person rather than slave when you're talking about this situation?
Yeah, Arlene, thank you very much for that. No, absolutely. We should be using enslaved, and we should be using enslaver, right? And the reason why, one, enslaved, right, still recognizes the humanity of the person who is in bondage, that this is a state, this is a political condition, and not who the person is, right? If you are enslaved, that means you can become there's a moment where you don't have to be enslaved, right? I mean, you're born, you may even be born into slavery, right? But that still does not define who you are as a human being. So I think it's really important for us to talk about enslaved people, enslaved persons, and the same way it's important for us to talk about enslavers, because that puts the burden, the action of holding people in bondage on the people themselves. Right? I mean, there's sort of a neutrality to slave owner and slave master. And actually, when you put the master in, it becomes a little hero worship. When we talk about Jefferson and all these people, they are enslavers. They are actively holding people against their will. And so that terminology really becomes important. And I think those two become really important when talking about this era in American history.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
So we have a couple more questions. The next one is coming from the chat. Dr. Jeffries, where do you see the growing attacks on CRT, AP history courses, and banning books leading to for the educational professional and on teaching African-American history in this divisive political climate?
Yeah, I think it's gonna get worse before it gets any better. I mean, like we like to think of America as sort of a history of perpetual progress, right? Like things always kind of get better, but they actually don't, right? And coming on the heels of 2020, when we were making real progress, you had state boards of education saying that here in Ohio, State Board of Education was like, we are complicit in perpetuating white supremacy and systemic inequality. And you had white folk around the state lost their mind, right? And then within 18 months, they had rescinded that, fired, removed board members, and are working these anti-divisive issues, anti-CRT bills through the state legislature. And so the momentum has only been building. And so I think it's going to be harder, especially for teachers in those districts that traditionally have not leaned into diversity, equity, inclusion and belonging issues. And it's going to make it harder to teach African-American history and the history of America in a really accurate and correct way. But there's always hope. Maybe I was in church too much, but there's always hope. The good news, right? Like, here's the good news, is that you have teachers who are committed to teaching this. You still have school districts who are committed to teaching it. States, the state of Connecticut just completely revamped its social studies curriculum, and it looks phenomenal in terms of state standards. But most importantly, you have students. Like just down in Alabama, in Hoover, Alabama, just outside of Birmingham, Alabama, some of you may have seen, the kids want to have some Black History Month programming, a reflection of this effort to silence the American past. And the school was like, well, yeah, you can do some Black History Month programming, but it can't deal with Black Lives Matter. It can't talk about civil rights movement, can't talk about slavery. Well, what the hell is left, right? And so what happened? The students went out, the students walked out, 200 students, Black and white. So the students, they know, they see, and they're actually going to be the ones who are going to force this issue more so than any teacher or any parent going forward.
Thank you. We're just about at time, but we have 2 more questions. Is that all right if we take them?
Yeah. So Lara said, just stop talking so long. So I'll be brief. I'll be brief.
All
I'll be
right,
brief.
so the first hand is Maritza Santillan.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Jeffries. I am a Chicana teacher in Los Angeles. I primarily teach other Latinx students. And I was wondering, because I am currently teaching them about Afro-Latino history, and I just wanted to make sure to be representative and not like overstep my, knowledge of the enslavement of African people, being mindful of other people's experiences and still trying to educate our students.
Well, you're approaching it from the right perspective, right? Is, being mindful of your own identity, being mindful of the students, being mindful of the history that you're drawing on. And I think particularly when we're talking about sort of the African diaspora, you're talking about Latinx culture, we're talking about Latinos, talking about Chicanos. What are we talking about? We're talking about a mixture of indigenous people with some European, with some African. It's all of us drawn together in some way, shape, or form. I think it's critically important too, though, when thinking about the African diaspora, the Afro-Latino diaspora, in the American context, that it is when we think about race in American context, is different than we think about race in the rest of the Americas, because it is very binary, it's very black and white, right? And that's just the way that America sort of evolved. And so it's important for all people, all students, to understand how this binary plays out and how their own racial and ethnic identity is impacted by this. And so it's critically important for Latinx students to understand this, because they're still going to have to walk the color line that is shaped by this black-white prism, right? Although it's refracted in different ways, it is still very much shaped by that black-white prism. So I'm so glad you're leaning into it. And one of the ways to draw them in, I think, is also to connect them to the Afro-Latino roots that influence and inform their cultural productions that they enjoy even today. So I think your approach is absolutely spot on. But we got to make sure we get our students interested and excited about this history.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, and our last question is from Sierra Schiano.
Hi, thank you so much for this really wonderful presentation. I really appreciate all the commentary you gave on each art piece and how you tied it back in for some things in the classroom. My role at LACMA is in the mobile education program, and I work a lot with our ancient world mobiles. So we are like going to 6th and 7th grade classrooms and bringing artifacts to the students for them to kind of handle and explore. And so a lot of our objects don't necessarily tie directly to enslavement in the ancient world, but sometimes it does come up. Oftentimes more like with teachers, they'll because a lot of our objects are Egyptian, and they'll make comments about, oh, pyramids built by slaves and stuff like that. Although that's something that's also kind of more modern scholarship is not as certain about that. But anyway, my thought was more like, when we think about enslavement in the ancient world and how it was like, from what we know today, probably not tied necessarily to race, but definitely still in these dynamics of power with like xenophobia and conflicts between nations and different people and whatnot. I'm just wondering, is there anything that you would have in mind in the way that we should be talking about enslavement in this period or context that would maybe help scaffold conversations later down the line? Or just any thoughts you might have about that, because it's something that's, in studying the ancient Mediterranean, I'm always thinking about, like, are people going to come to this conversation thinking that slavery is inherently tied to race, even though it's throughout time not necessarily the case? So yeah, and how to approach that conversation. Yeah, because I don't want to, by bringing up that fact, don't want to in some way diminish the reality of enslavement type race in America in modern times. So that's the kind of the mess there. But
No. It's a great question, and it's an important one, because we have to acknowledge that most of our students come to an understanding, or a lot of our students actually come to an understanding of what slavery is, or at least what they think it is, what transatlantic slavery what they think transatlantic slavery is, from the ancient world, from biblical texts, from the Bible, right? And we frame that ancient world slavery as not so bad, right? And so what then happens is, it's about Spartacus and all this other, heroes and champions, and it's like, it's not so bad. Have you read the Old Testament? right? I mean, this is like people, begetting and begotten and smiting and smoting, right? I mean, it's terrible, but it becomes a sanitized version, right? The past. And so in the minds of many students, it's like, well, American slavery, like, can't then be that bad, right? Because the slavery is slavery. No, slavery isn't slavery. One of the things that we know in sort of human existence is there have been forms of involuntary servitude, right? And we still got some of those today in the world, in the modern world today. There have been forms of involuntary servitude. But one of the things that is fundamentally different about this thing that becomes transatlantic slavery is that the folk who are held in bondage, the African people who are held in bondage, is that they're actually cast out of the human family, right? There is no social mobility for them. This is permanent. This is something that is not just permanent, not just for life, but is transferable from mother to child, right? I mean, it's qualitatively different than anything that came before it. And I think that's the critical point to point out. You can draw the connections between power, right, and labor and exploitation, right? So you want to point those out. You don't want to have the sanitized, oh, this is just some biblical stuff, so I guess it's all cool. Like, no. It still was unfree, right? And people were still critical of it, but it's also radically different than what happened and what we saw that gave birth and rise to the nations that we live in today. And so I think some of that work of distinguishing between what comes later and what you're dealing with in the ancient world is really important, so that the kids don't think that it's the same and therefore not as bad, one way or the other. It's a challenge, but I'm glad you're taking that, and I think it can be an opportunity as well.
Thank you, Dr. Jeffries. That was wonderful. Thank you for taking everybody's questions. I think we're going to go ahead and close the program out. We do have a survey we'd love for you to fill out. This helps us continue to have programs like this at LACMA, so do fill out the survey. It's very important. And just want to say thank you again, Dr. Jeffries. This was truly a wonderful experience. Good night.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Good night, everyone, and good luck.